The next bill on the calendar for today is Senate File 878. The clerk will report the bill.
Senate File number 878, number 1 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to criminal justice.
There is a DE amendment to insert the House language into Senate File 878. The clerk will report the amendment.
Moves to amend Senate File 878, the second engrossment as follows. Delete everything after the enacting clause and insert the following language of House File 849, the second engrossment.
The member from Blue Earth, Representative Cornish, to introduce your bill.
Mr. Speaker and members, now it's a Senate file, and I'd like to start out first with, if it's okay, with thanking the staff. First of all, our committee administrator, Mike Ballou, our House researchers, Jeff Diebel and Rebecca Pirius, fiscal analyst, John Walsh, GOP research, Brian Rosenblatt, DFL research, Laura Taken-Holtze, the committee LA, Simon Gottlieb, and our pages, Dominique Hudson, Barb Smith, and Andrew Nader. Without them, not much of this would have been possible. And I think there is another amendment at the desk, Mr. Speaker, the A28.
We need to adopt the House language first. All those in favor of replacing the Senate language with the House language signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails. There is, Representative Cornish, would you like to do that amendment next, the author's amendment?
I would, the A28.
There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Cornish moves to amend Senate File 878, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A28.
Representative Cornish, to your amendment.
Mr. Speaker and members, the A28 amendment requires that half the appropriations in the combat terrorism recruitment be distributed through grants to local government. Also inserts House File 12, my Blue Alert system bill, and it deletes the section on requiring BCA to do background checks at the request of the American Indian Tribes, House File 1432, because that bill has already been enacted and signed, so there's no need to have it in here. I would appreciate your support.
Mr.
Discussion on the amendment? The member from Hennepin, Representative Kahn.
Mr. Speaker, I can't quite find it, but I know that one of the things that we did in this bill was increase the amount of money that was going to go to deal with the issue of Somali community and terrorism issues. I can't figure out where it says that in the amendment. Could you please, or do I have the wrong amendment?
He will yield. The member from Blue Earth, Representative Cornish.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Kahn, I was going to do a run-through of the whole the budget sheet and the accompanying bills, and I would answer that within that if you'd like.
Representative Kahn, we're on the A28 amendment right now.
Yes, I have the A28 amendment, and I want to know, does this amendment do anything to the 250? You had a clause that put 25,000 into countering terrorist issues. I raised that to 250,000, and I want to know if this amendment does anything to that. I can't figure it out. I'm sorry. Sorry if I'm the only person on the floor who can't figure it out.
He will yield. Representative Cornish.
Mr. Speaker and members, it doesn't do anything to what she was talking about.
Representative Kahn.
Okay, so that language on the 250,000 is exactly as it left the Public Safety Committee and the Ways and Means Committee?
Representative Cornish will yield. Representative Cornish.
Are you talking, Mr. Speaker and Representative Khan, are you talking about the money that to combat terrorism? That the change there is that it goes out to at least a certain percentage goes out to the local grants. Half the appropriations combat terrorism recruitment be distributed through grants to local governments. That's the change. Instead of going to the DPS, all of it.
Representative Khan.
So it doesn't go to anything, Mr. Chairman, again, continuing, Mr. Speaker, sorry, continuing the conversation with Representative Cornish. So it goes through the grants to local governments. So does that mean, Representative Cornish, if you'll yield, like in the city of Minneapolis, it would go to the city council. In Hennepin County, it would go to Hennepin County. I just don't understand who's distributing the grants.
He will yield. Representative Cornish.
Mr. Speaker and members, this would, Representative Khan, this would go to the local governments who would apply through grants to DPS for that money. They would apply for the grants, much like OJP, where you apply to grants, to OJP for grants, they would apply to the DPS for these grants.
Representative Khan.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker and Representative Cornish, one of the reasons why I increased the amount was that I really think we needed to do serious thought about what we're going to do. We can't just willy-nilly put this into law enforcement because there's a certain amount in this community of a little distrust of law enforcement, and I think we needed some serious thinking of new ways to do it. I'm not sure when you take the money and cut it in half and then you distribute that half to all sorts of local governments, we're going to get the kind of discussion about what kind of basic programs that we need to do this. So I guess I won't divide it or oppose it at this time, but I am, I am, I guess, a little concerned that this direction may not go in the way to give us the imaginative kinds of solutions that we may need.
Any further discussion on the 828 amendment? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of adoption of the 828 amendment signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. I believe we have the bill in the format the author would like. If you'd like to do your run through of the bill, Representative Cornish.
Mr. Speaker and members, I'll start out by giving a quick run through of the budget and then the accompanying bills that are attached to it or enclosed within. And I'd be glad to get into the weeds as far as you would like. I'll run through it quickly here and then come back if you've got any concentrated questions in any sort of the budget sheet or the accompanying documents. I'd be glad to answer. What we did in the Supreme Court to start out with, we gave the judges 1.5%. The governor's recs were at 5 and 5. We gave 1.5. And the Court of Appeals, the same thing, 1.5%. The district courts, we gave 1.5. We didn't give an increase money to the jurors per diem or mileage rates. I skipped one there, excuse me, civil legal services. We cut that about in half from 1.03 to 500,000. And if you got questions on any of these, we'll get back to them. The guardian ad litem, we didn't give them the pay equity. We gave them the 1.5 salary increase, but the pay equity, what they had done was they had contracted vendors and they decided to switch those to state employees, but they didn't come to us and talk about that, so we didn't give them the pay equity. The tax court was 1.5. We didn't give them the additional law clerk that they asked for. Uniform Laws Commission, Governor's Recs, Board of Judicial Standards, Governor's Recs with the 1.5 additional part-time staff they asked for. Public Defense had a request for 41 FTEs, and we gave them 20.5. Public Safety, we did 1.8%. The governor's recs were at 1.8% for public safety, BCA, and we gave them that for the salary and insurance increase. They had wanted a records management 2 staff, and we gave them 1. And there you'll see that's where we put the we cut the 11 million on the disaster contingency to 2.5. On the then you'll see the anti-Al Shabaab recruitment put in there. And then you'll notice House File 800. In some of these, the chemical assessment, others further down in the fire marshal, this isn't new money. What this is a distribution of that fire safety money we were talking about. And this is where we differ a lot with the Senate. Mary Liz Holberg and I and others had worked for a long time to protect this fire safety account. You remember the debate about that a few years ago? But the Senate takes quite a few million out of that. We didn't. We left that as is and added some language about more freer distribution to the Fire Training Board. The Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, you'll see a number of changes there. Latent fingerprints, they wanted 5, we gave them 2. Mitochondrial, they asked for 2, we gave them 1. We cut about 50%. Supplies, we cut from 350,000 to 175. Digital forensics, they wanted 9, we gave them 4.5. Financial crimes, 5 down to 2.5. Predatory crimes from 13 to 8.5. And they wanted live scan replacement, the fingerprint machines you see or you hear about in all of the law enforcement people that have those. And we gave them a little longer on the expiration than they did, and we cut that down from 911 to 650,000. Or excuse me, 911 to 500 it looks like. Then we move down into the fire marshal's office. You'll see a number of house files there, and that is how they distributed that money. And once again, that's not new money. That is the money that's within the fire safety account we're just distributing. On to the gambling enforcement, there was Governor's Recs, Office of Justice Programs. There was the same thing in the salary and insurance Governor's Recs, but then we did some changing there. We have a number of House files there that I'll get into when I read off this list of the House file bills that were added into those programs there. Emergency communications, we took the Governor's Recs. They have the authority to increase their own fees. The Peace Officers Standards of Training Board, Governor's Recs, Private Detectives, Governor's Recs, Corrections. We did a lot of changing here. We gave them the 1-point salary and insurance. The most controversial one probably here was the kitchen workers. And that was what had happened here is the Department of Corrections had decided to change over their vendors to state employees for the kitchen workers, and we didn't authorize that. They told us they were going to do this with or without additional funding. And so when they told us that, plus they had already made that decision before they came to us, we didn't fund that. And then you'll see in the rest of them there, we cut back. We didn't grant the request for the electronic health records or the 24-hour coverage for 3 facilities. We fully funded the Fugitive Apprehension Task Force. At the original request was 5, and later on it was 8, but we granted the original request in the governor's budget of 5 FTEs. And the reason we did this is because it was a high-profile team, and there was a big article in the news media about that, about how behind they were on warrants because they were spending all their time on sex offenders and they had more work than they could ever do. And this has been going on for a few years, and so that's why we fully funded the first part. And then you'll see a couple of House files in there that will talk about sex trafficking and criminal vehicular homicide enhancement. Community services probation, we took the governor's recs on that, where they sprinkled a few million over the different formulas there. And operations support, you'll see a House file in there. Insurance for permanently disabled employees if somebody gets assaulted and they're permanently disabled. We have a cost in there of 17 up to 34, 17 and 34. And we talked to the agencies there, and they're going to absorb the cost. Sentencing guidelines, governor's recs, and that takes care of it for the budget sheet. In the bill, and the policy provisions, is we have a House file. First, I should say, in introducing the bill, we had a number of, I think Representative Hillstrom's got about 5 things in here. We've got, it's a pretty nonpartisan bill, or bipartisan, I should say. And we all got along pretty good in the committee and put together a fairly non-controversial bill. The only controversy really you'll find in this bill probably is the amounts of money we put into each category. I think we only had 3 roll call votes. 2 of them were in the last meeting. And I think we did a pretty good job of making out the bill here. The House File 104 is Representative Norton's, a vulnerable adult. House File 233 is Representative Hancock's bill, alternative to use interactive video in civil commitment. 273 is Representative Ugelman's, is the Youth Intervention Program grants. House File 291 was my necessity defense, and this is about the case where the lady was trying to escape from her husband while driving drunk, and this ended up in wasn't able to use that defense in the implied consent portion of the hearing, and this would allow them to use that in the implied consent. Representative Fabian has the gun bills. Well, I forgot to mention there's the 4 gun bills, and this was the other controversial part. I should have said it was non-controversial, but what I meant by that is that's something that we pretty much of us already had the argument on and voted. There'll be some more talk about that today. Representative Fabian has the reciprocity bill of North Dakota. Representative Howe has a wages and payroll modification for volunteer firefighters and ambulance. Representative Nash has the notice of possession of firearms at the Capitol. O'Driscoll has the de-escalation training grants. Representative Zerwas, crime victim services grants. Representative Erdahl has eligibility here for co-ops to get power-related disaster money. Representative Johnson, Child Advocacy Center grants. Representative Zerwas, Community Supervision grant. Representative Hillstrom has the bill about crime of defamation. Representative Newberger is the Emergency Powers Bill. Representative Albright of Scott County, we've got some money in probation there. When they entered into a probation agreement, they didn't get all the money that they were supposed to. Representative Hillstrom has the prosecutor law enforcement training grants. I've got one 783 for assault protection employees working with mentally ill and dangerous. Senator Sharon has got it in the Senate, and I think they were voting on that today in the Senate. That's moving right along. House File 800, that's those bills that we talked about distributing money in the fire safety account. And then Representative Johnson has a new arson offense. Representative Lucero has the firearm sale in other states, or purchasing firearm in other states, I should say. Representative Hillstrom at a 5th degree assault Fifth degree, criminal sexual conduct, and that's the adulteration of bodily fluid bill that we talked about before on the floor. Representative Hertos, it's an electronic home monitoring bill. Representative Zerwas, the alternatives to juvenile detention. Representative Schoen has one, technical changes made to statutes resulting from redundant or repealed public safety statutes. Representative Garofalo has got the one where this version of the bill talks about reckless driving and careless driving failure to yield that the ABATE's been after for a number of increased penalties. Representative O'Neill, consecutive sentences for assaults by inmates in medical institutions. Representative Schoen on untested sexual assault kits, a report required on those. Representative O'Neill, expansion of specialty courts. Representative Quam has one for sex trafficking. Representative Lane talks about incarcerated women and restraints. Representative Hertos, DWI task force recommendation. Representative Barrett, controlled substances. Representative Green, that one that was there we took out because it's already been passed. Representative Hillstrom has to do with recorded creations in creation of recordings in locker rooms and changing rooms prohibited. Representative Anderson has his suppressors bill. Representative Schoen has crime support victims grants. Zerwas has one. Representative Zerwas on the interest on verdicts. There's a number of amendments about that today. Representative Howe has his firefighter licensure. Representative Hornstein, a fine or prohibition wireless communications device. And the Representative Vogel, tax court conforming changes. Representative Pinto on sex trafficking prevention grants. Representative Hillstrom on court reporters and court reporting firms required to charge similar amounts or same rate. Representative Lomer, community corrections formula-based funding modified, and Representative O'Neill has one on the automatic reporting system requirements for recycling. And that's it for the, if you've got any specifics, questions on budget amounts or on separate bills that the members can stand up and address themselves. If there are no questions, we could move on to amendments. Mr. Speaker, that's it for the introduction, so take it from here.
Mr. Speaker, if I could get a call of the House.
Representative Thiessen moves for a call of the House. Seeing 10 hands, the clerk will take the roll. The clerk will close the roll. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Howell moves to amend Senate File 878, the second Grossman, as amended, and the amendment is coded RA 15-016.
The member from Stearns, Representative Howe, to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And members, this is in a response to what we've had happening is a stolen valor, people impersonating military members. And we had a recent incident where the perpetrator, he was actually dressed up, actively walking in parades, dressed up as a sergeant major. And if that wasn't bad enough, which to me is very, very bad, because the sergeant majors in the Army are the people that get things done and protect our enlisted folks. What happens here is they didn't charge him because in our statute it says military officer. And I contend that they should have charged him because the sergeant major is a non-commissioned officer. They decided that they did not do that. So my amendment, what it does is it takes out the military officer and makes it an active or reserve component military service member or veteran. Because I contend that I propose that even if they're impersonating an enlisted soldier to the E1, E2, or even not dressing up in a uniform but claiming that they're a veteran, I don't believe that should be allowed. Members, that's the amendment. I think we need to strengthen that bill and make it a crime no matter who you're trying to impersonate.
There is an amendment to the amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Lesh moves to amend the Howe amendment to Senate File 878, the second Grossman, as amended. And the amendment to the amendment is coded A31.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Lesh, to introduce your amendment to the Howe amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, my amendment to the amendment essentially gives Representative Howe's amendment a haircut. I understand what Representative Howe is trying to do. I believe that, though, it is a little too broad. I don't think a buck private, an E1, an E-Fuzz, walking into a Legion post or a VFW is the same as, say, a police officer, someone impersonating a police officer on the street. And if you ask individuals, members of those posts, they'll tell you that it is a very different thing from impersonating a private or impersonating a general, or impersonating a private or impersonating a command sergeant major, which was the case with this Richard Arthur Ron, who apparently fooled enough people enough at the time. You saw pictures of him wearing his tan beret, and a tan beret is the mark of a Ranger, 75th Ranger Regiment. He had his Ranger deployment badge, he had his Ranger tab, and in the military that's a pretty big deal. He also had a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. And to the average person out there, they're going to see someone in uniform and that's significant. But walking into a Legion post, or for those folks that really track this stuff, it's a much bigger deal to say that you're a command sergeant major having deployed with the 75th Ranger Regiment, 3rd Battalion. And so what my amendment does is it says, if you hold yourself out to be an Army officer or an NCO, because in the military you got the lower ranks, the junior ranks of NCOs. These are the enlisted personnel. That's E1 buck private, that's E2 private, up to private first class, PFC, as well as specialists, or what some are fond of calling full bird private. So E1 through E4. After that, E5, you start seeing the chevrons on the sleeves. You see those chevrons, and as you go up in chevrons, as the chevrons become more ornate, it's higher rank. But those folks are NCOs. The folks with the chevrons are the NCOs. And those are the folks, I think, the non-commissioned officers are the ones who you should be held accountable for impersonating. But as my drill sergeant back at Basic told me, you could line up all the privates in the world and they'd string all the way around the globe. There are just a lot of privates. And I don't know if we want to apply this change or this law to all of them. So I'd ask you to help me give Representative Howe's bill a little bit of a haircut. I don't think that a buck private should be in the same legal category of impersonating as a police officer. It's a pretty big deal. Those of us, when we see a police officer on the street, you have to do something. You pretty much have to do what they tell you within the bounds of the law. The same is not true for those junior ranks of military personnel. And for those who are veterans, it is a significant slap in the face. There is no question about it. It's shameful, especially if you have the other indicators on your uniform that do not suggest rank. So Ranger Tab, Bronze Star, Silver Star, Purple Heart. But this bill won't get at that. And so, anyway, I hope you support my amendment to the amendment.
Representative O'Driscoll.
Mr. Speaker, point of parliamentary inquiry.
State your point of parliamentary inquiry.
I rise today to tell you that I believe that the Lesh amendment to the A31 amendment is out of order. It deletes Section 7 and attempts to insert additional language, which is not germane under Mason's 401 paragraph 2, which attempts to change the spirit and intent of the original amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are you raising to a point of order?
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, yes.
Representative O'Driscoll raises a point of order under which Masons?
Mr. Speaker, Mason's 401 paragraph 2, because we have a deletion of in the Lesh amendment, we delete on page 1 of the amendment, section 7, and the Lesh amendment attempts to insert additional language that changes the amendment according to Mason's 401 paragraph 2.
Representative Lesh.
Well, Mr. Speaker, advice.
State your advice.
Mr. Speaker, I don't have my Masons with me, but I'm essentially changing the same line of wording as Representative Howe. So maybe Representative O'Driscoll could clarify his intent, but at this point, it strikes me as, well, I ask you to find it not well taken.
Any further advice? The member from Olmsted, Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Advice, I'm looking at the section that was quoted by Representative O'Driscoll, and it says an amendment is not in order that would change one kind of motion into another kind, or that would substitute one kind for another kind. I cannot understand how that point of order would apply to rule the Lesh amendment to the amendment out of order. It just seems to I think that Representative O'Driscoll's problem might be that he doesn't like what it's doing, but it's certainly not changing it from one kind of thing into another.
Further advice, Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Advice. I hate to say it, but somewhere Ed Burdick is rolling in his grave. We don't use Masons where we have a rule on point, and we have a rule precisely on point, 3.21 sub B, that relates to what an amendment to an amendment can pertain to. And it's important when we're talking about points of order under Masons that Masons is full of contradictory advice on different topics. And we only turn to Masons when we don't have any direction from our state constitution, our statutes, or our House rules.
Any further advice? The member from Scott, Representative Albright.
Mr. Speaker, advice. As I look at these two amendments, the one thing that I'm struck by in the Howe amendment versus the Lesh amendment, which is an amendment to the Howe amendment, is under this, I don't know that you can replace language in an amendment to an amendment. That would be my advice to the chair.
Mr. Speaker, advice?
State your advice.
Mr. Speaker, as I understand it, custom and usage overrules Masons, and in my limited time in this body so far, I've never seen an amendment to an amendment be, to my mind, this amendment to the amendment is at least as germane as many others that I've seen even in my couple months here. So I would suggest that you rule the point, not in order. Thank you.
Members, having reviewed the section of Mason's, the House rules, and the amendment and the amendment to the amendment, unfortunately, the amendment to the amendment is drafted as a substitute amendment. It completely deletes the amendment. If that was adopted, we'd basically be voting on the same amendment twice. And I believe the custom and the usage of this body is not to allow amendments to that effect. So for that reason, I will find the point of order well taken.
Mr. Speaker, point of parliamentary inquiry.
State your point of parliamentary inquiry.
Could you repeat what you just said to everybody in the body so everybody understands that fact? Because we have had a lot of amendments drafted that didn't need to be drafted this way. So if you could just repeat that fact to people, I think that would be very helpful.
In this instance, members, the amendment to the amendment, if you read on line 1.3 on the A31 amendment to the amendment, it deletes the entire, basically deletes the entire amendment and substitutes new language. It's actually, it's drafted as a substitute amendment, which the history of this body, the custom and usage has been that we don't allow that. If we did, we would be voting, and if this amendment to the amendment were adopted, we'd be voting on the amendment to the amendment twice. And it's just not proper procedure to do that. So I'm ruling and have ruled that the amendment to the amendment is out of order for that reason. So members, we're back on the RA 15-016 amendment, the Howe amendment. Further discussion on that amendment. The member from Washington, Representative Detmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do support Representative Howe's amendment. We have to realize that regardless of your rank in the military, you could have E1s, E2, E3s as Medal of Honor winners that our country has had in the past. So I like the idea of treating all the ranks the same, and I support the Howe amendment.
Any further discussion on the Howe amendment? Seeing no further, oh, sorry, Representative Lesch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Detmer yield to a question?
He will yield. Representative Lesch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Detmer, there's a guy across the alley from me who, on a Saturday, he'll get out in his ACUs. They're old ACUs with the patches torn off, and he'll use those. Those are his lawn mowing clothes. So in doing this and getting out and mowing his lawn, apparently he doesn't want to buy any Carhartts or anything. He uses his old ACOs. Would he be in violation of this statute if this amendment were to go on?
Representative Detmer.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Lesch, no, he wouldn't be in violation of the statute. I know many veterans have old uniforms that they use for hunting or whatever and so forth after they take their patches off, but you're not supposed to be using your uniforms for other purposes, especially if you're serving, and that's the policies we have in the military.
Representative Lesch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Representative Detmer, I think that's the issue because we're not passing military policy here. We're passing state law. And the language of Representative Howe's amendment, since it was not modified at all by the one that I offered, now means that if you're holding yourself out, that in fact that could easily be determined as a violation of the law. So your suggestion that you're not supposed to, as a military person, wear the uniform is irrelevant to the decision we're making here today. I think that's a major issue. Mr. Speaker, would Representative Howe yield a question?
He will yield. Representative Lesh.
Thank you. Representative Howe, can you tell me what are the lines in your mind whereby one could wear a uniform? And I'm not talking about military policy or what your unit commander tells you can do. Under this law, what are the lines in your mind?
Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Lesh. The lines are is when you impersonate someone to make them believe something that you're not. I believe that's in the language of the current law, and when you're impersonating someone to make them believe that you're something you're not. And I will tell you, Representative Lesh, I think this is of ultimate importance right now, especially when we have people on state active duty, because there can be E1s, E2s, E3s on state active duty which may have the responsibility to protect the perimeter, and they should. And if you could have someone today on impersonating one of those gentlemen, and I don't think that's what we need to have. I think we need to have rules in place that do not allow someone to impersonate someone, especially when we have state active duty going on. Thank you.
Representative Lesh.
Would Representative Howe yield to another question?
He will yield. Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Howe, we've had instances in this state and there are other neighboring states where individuals have impersonated police officers, and they've actually stopped people in their car. And this has gotten in the news, and it's modified behavior on the part of especially women who are driving, the concern that this person could stop them and they're not a legitimate police officer. Do you think that someone walking as a private down the street, or even with the patches taken off, which would indicate you're an E1, do you think that is as severe as imitating a police officer?
Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Lesh, I don't believe someone walking down the street in a uniform is trying to impersonate and make them believe that there's something they're not. I believe that now if they strike up a conversation, may be a different story. But just wearing something probably doesn't impersonate someone to make them believe that there's something they're not.
Mr. Speaker, would Representative Howe yield to an additional question?
He will. Representative Lesh.
Well, Representative Howe, there's the rub. Because you're not the one who decides this. Your language is wide open for a jury to interpret that. And the thrust of your amendment here has the same effect. So if there are no military members of a jury and they don't understand the way things work or what ranks are, they may have the same belief that someone walking around in a uniform does something as significant or is as significantly as harmful as holding yourself out to be a police officer or holding yourself out to be a command sergeant major replete with deployment patches for the 75th Ranger Regiment, a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and a Ranger Tab. That are very different things, and yet you're putting them in the same category of statute. Why is it that you're equating them?
Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Lesh, we have not changed that portion of the law. All we're doing is changing who is included. It doesn't change what the impersonating piece is. So if someone walks down the street in an officer's uniform, if they're not trying to make someone believe and imposing that belief on other people, they probably wouldn't be charged on this either until they enter in a conversation and try to make them believe something that they're not. So we haven't changed the level of requirement of proof at all in this statute. We've just included all service members and all veterans. That's all we've done. We have not changed the level of proof.
Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Howe, I don't think you do completely understand what you just did, because there is nowhere written in your amendment that you have to have a conversation with someone or convince them orally that you hold this particular position or this position, this particular rank. Members, this is where it's a problem. I think we have stretched the previous statute out quite broadly. The situation that was cited by Representative Howe of this character out in Wilmer, who is holding himself out to be a command sergeant major, and in my opinion, sharing that opinion with Representative Howe, I think he could have been charged because he was holding himself out to be an NCO, and as county attorney, they could have interpreted a non-commissioned officer to also be an officer, but he didn't. And so I think an appropriate fix would have been to include the NCO ranks in there. But I do not think it's appropriate holding yourself out as someone or wearing a uniform of a private fresh out of boot camp is equal to impersonating a police officer. I'm going to be voting no on this today, members.
Representative Albright.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Lesh rise for a question?
He will yield. Representative Albright.
Representative Lesh, when you entered the service, I'm wondering if you can recall the text of the oath that you took at your swearing in.
Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Albright, I'm sure I couldn't cite it verbatim, but yes, I remember it.
Representative Albright.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Lesh, would that oath be any different from any other service branch or from any other position within the military services? We do all understand they take the same oath of office, do they not?
He will yield. Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Albright, I've never been in the Navy, nor have I been a police officer. As a prosecutor, I do take an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States as well as the Constitution of the State of Minnesota, just like we do here on the opening day of session.
Representative Albright.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Lesh, near I can tell, regardless of your rank within any military service branch, you accept the same oath, whether you're a private or whether you're a general. You lay your life on the line every day. And so to suggest that a junior grade officer has less to give to their country or less to be proud of in the service to their country than a general, Representative Lesh, I find offensive.
Mr. Speaker.
Representative Howe. Representative Howe.
I guess, Mr. Speaker, I missed the...
You had requested to speak. You were next on the list. Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The deal, I think that we need to be clear is it's the intent. And that's always the piece of the law that we need to prove is the intent. And as long as there is no intent to impersonate, there is no charge. So you can't get charged with just walking down the street unless you have an intent to defame. But I do believe that if you were on state active duty today as an E1 or an E2, you do have full authority, and if someone's impersonating someone as an E2, that they should be charged under this. The other thing is when you talk about the E4s, it depends on what service you're in, whether an E4 is an NCO or not. And now you're really laying it on the people that are not in the service to determine who's an NCO and who's not an NCO. Because only those folks, what I'm gathering here, in the certain particular service would know that a third-class petty officer in the Navy who is an E4 is an NCO, but yet a specialist in the Army is not, but yet a corporal in the Army is. So let's not get into particulars. Let's just call it what it is, and if you're being an imposter of a service member, let's call it what it is and charge him with a misdemeanor.
The member from Blue Earth, Representative Cornish.
Mr. Speaker and members, we spent way too much time on a simple amendment by Representative Howe. What he's saying is you shouldn't impersonate somebody out of respect for the uniform. And Representative Lesh, you jumped right into the jury trial. You forgot your job as a prosecutor. If you don't screw up, or if the other prosecutors don't screw up and charge it when it shouldn't be charged, it'll never get to the jury. So I think we should get beyond this. It's a simple amendment to respect for the armed services and not impersonating, and let it go with a yes vote.
Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Albright, the enlisted personnel in my unit don't need your false indignation about what they do or don't do. You stand up and say, if everyone takes the same oath, then put it in as an amendment. If the oath is important to you, put it in. If you think that we are as important as those military personnel as the privates in my unit because we take the same oath, I submit you're wrong. But they don't need your accolades. They don't need your protection.
Any further discussion on the Howe amendment? The member from Anoka, Representative Newton.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Representative Howe, I think this is a very good amendment, and I think it gets to intent, and intent is important in this case, and I urge everyone to support the Howe amendment.
Any further discussion on the Howe amendment? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of the Howe amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. There is another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Schoen moves to amend Senate File 878, the second Grossman as amended. The amendment is coded A17.
The member from Washington, Representative Schoen, to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The main amendment removes the Nash portion of the bill related to the capital carry, but we're trying to get to the amendments to the amendments, so whichever one you go with first, let me know.
There is an amendment to the amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Schoen moves to amend his amendment to Senate File 878, the second Grossman as amended, and the amendment to the amendment is coded A30.
The member from Washington, Representative Schoen, to your amendment to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and this amendment is related to background checks and firearm sales. What I would just encourage everybody here is to vote your district, whether you're Burnsville or Baudette or Apple Valley or Aiken, vote your district.
The member from Carver, Representative Nash, to the A30 amendment.
Mr. Speaker, point of order.
State your point of order.
Mr. Speaker, under House Rules 3.2.1, subsection B, I would advise this be ruled out of order, and I'm prepared to offer advice.
State your advice, Representative Nash.
Mr. Speaker, I would advise you find this out of order. Because an amendment to an amendment on the House floor must relate only to the primary amendment without introducing a new subject.
Mr. Speaker.
Representative Schoen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It seems like we're getting a little bit afar trying to avoid some of these votes, but the reality is this is a firearms bill and firearms-related amendment, and that's what this is about.
Members, after reviewing the amendment and the amendment to the amendment and the rule, and upon the advice of a couple of members, I find the point of order well taken.
Mr. Speaker,
Representative
I'd like to challenge
Schoen.
the ruling of the chair and ask for roll call.
Representative Schoen moves to appeal the ruling of the Speaker and requests a roll call. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Members, again, the question before the body is, shall the decision of the Speaker stand as the judgment of the House? A yes or green vote supports the ruling of the Speaker, a no or red vote goes against the ruling of the Speaker. Discussion on that question. Seeing no discussion, let me repeat it one more time and then we'll take the roll. The question before the body is, shall the decision of the Speaker stand as the judgment of the House? A yes or green vote supports the ruling of the Speaker. A no or red vote goes against the ruling of the Speaker. The clerk will take the roll on the question. Members, as a reminder, the House is under call. Please vote. The clerk will close the roll. There being 79 ayes and 51 nays, it is the judgment of the House that the decision of the Speaker shall stand. There is another amendment to the amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Yeah, that was the 830. Schoen moves to amend the Schoen amendment to Senate File 878, second Grossman as amended, and the amendment to the amendment is coded A32.
The member from Washington, Representative Schoen, to your amendment to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the original amendment removes the Nash language. You know, I thought maybe that's not quite right. Maybe we should put that back in, but clarify that that you're not allowed to carry firearms in the Capitol or areas where we're meeting or deliberating while school children are present. The other day, you ruled it out of order because it had what you thought was some financial implications. Well, I've removed all those and made it so that it doesn't. So this is definitely part of that particular original bill, and I would urge a green vote on this, and I'd ask for a roll call.
A roll call has been requested. Seeing 15
Speaker,
hands, there will be a roll call. Representative Nash.
Mr. Speaker, point of order.
State your point of order.
I would move that this be ruled out of order under Mason's Section 401, Subdivision 2. An amendment is not in order when would change one kind of motion into another kind that would substitute one kind for another kind, and that's what Representative Schoen has done here. And I'm willing to offer advice.
State your advice.
Mr. Speaker, I would advise that this point be well taken.
Mr. Speaker.
Representative Schoen.
We are, you know, here's the deal. You can vote it down. You're in the majority. There's people over here going to vote against it. Why is it so hard to come to this body and have the courage to take a vote? Because you know your constituents will support it? And now we're off into Mason's land. Maybe we should get a new book, too. Let's get another one so we can dig even further to find some rule to say that we don't have to vote on something. Mr. Speaker.
Representative Schoen.
Well, I know many times under Mason's points of order, you've made comments about we should be really careful and just warn us. Maybe you could just do that with this one too and just warn us and be very careful about the amendments that we draft.
Members, after looking at the rule, our House rules, the original amendment and the amendment to the amendment, and after looking at them very closely, I'm going to find the point of order well taken.
Mr. Speaker, I
Representative
challenge
Schoen.
the ruling of the Speaker and ask for a roll call.
Representative Schoen moves to appeal the ruling of the Speaker and requests a roll call vote. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Members, as a reminder, the question before the body is, shall the decision of the Speaker stand as the judgment of the House? A yes or green vote supports the ruling of the Speaker. A no or red vote goes against the ruling of the Speaker. Discussion on that question. Seeing no discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the question. The House is under call, members. Please vote. The clerk will close the roll. Hamilton votes aye. Miller votes aye. There being 81 ayes and 50 nays, it is the judgment of the House that the decision of the Speaker shall stand.
Mr. Speaker.
Representative Schoen.
And since we didn't want to make it safer for school kids here, there's no reason to oppose the Nash bill in this form, so we can withdraw that underlying amendment.
Representative Schoen withdraws the A17 amendment. There is another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Winkler moves to amend Senate File 878, the second Grossman as amended, and the amendment is coded A23.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler, to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, the A23 amendment clarifies in Minnesota law that a person who conceives a child through sexual assault or rape should not have parental rights, or at least there should be a legal mechanism for doing so. And it's a pretty straightforward amendment. And members, on the state government finance bill, I got an amendment approved 129-0. I don't expect a unanimous vote today, but I'm hoping that Representative Cornish would accept this amendment and that we could move quickly through this and get a positive vote and move on to the rest of the bill.
Discussion to the Winkler amendment. The member from Blue Earth, Representative Cornish.
Mr. Speaker, members, I would say that we should accept the amendment from my good friend, Representative Winkler.
Any further discussion of the Winkler amendment? Seeing none, all those in favor of adoption of the Winkler amendment signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Loeffler moves to amend the Senate File 878, the second Grossman as amended, and the amendment is coded A24.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Loeffler, to introduce your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. The A24 amendment is an amendment asking our Supreme Court, in consultation with others involved in our court system, to consider a variety of ways to improve juror compensation and report back to the 2016 legislature on the approaches that they feel are most viable for us to look at. And I know Chair Cornish wishes he'd had a target that would have enabled him to improve juror compensation, but I think a lot of people have forgotten we're down to $10 a day. $10 a day for stepping up and doing your civic duty. And while there's always some sacrifice in public service, no matter what its form, it shouldn't put you into a financial tailspin if you're a low-wage worker who's asked to take a number of days off from work in order to serve on a jury. And the amendment is within available resources. I would like to let you know that next week is Juror Appreciation Week. Our courts Chief Justice just announced that last week, or yesterday, that it's next week, and I hope you'll all join me in adding that to your weekly updates to remind people that we really appreciate those who step up to these difficult tasks. The amendment simply asks them to, within available resources, look at a variety of options and tell us which ones they think are worth us considering further.
Discussion to the Loeffler amendment. The member from Blue Earth, Representative Cornish.
Mr. Speaker and members, I would advise that we do not accept this amendment. We vote no. If we would have taken the governor's recs, this would have been about 3.2 mil, and we discussed this in their committee when we put the bill together and thought that it was their civic duty to do this. And a study isn't really needed because the courts already did a study. That's how they came up with the recommendations here and on the route through to the governor. And so I would just advise a vote no. We just needed to put the money somewhere else, and I haven't heard from a single juror. This came from the governor's recs, and I would just advise a no vote.
Representative Loeffler.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Actually, I spent a fair amount of the interim talking to a variety of different judges, and the list of issues and potential ways to deal with this actually came from them. And while some of them were studied by the courts in their more recent study, and I appreciate their work on that, a couple of them are other new ideas that they have told me about from how other states have handled it. Just simply ask the courts to look at it. It's a way for us to tell our citizens who step up and for $10 a day sit in judgment and their peers A difficult job sometimes because it's the more gray cases oftentimes that go to the jury, that we think this is an issue worth continuing to look at and to ponder and to get information on in the future. I'd urge a yes vote.
Any further discussion on the Loeffler amendment? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of adoption of the Loeffler amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There is another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Clark moves to amend Senate File 878, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A19.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Clark, to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I provided a handout for you on your desk that should explain to you a little bit more about why this amendment is before you. We're talking about here an actual bill that was provided to fund emergency shelter for East African women and children. This is a project that started last year with some funding, but it was insufficient to carry it forward. There were additional construction issues with sprinklering and a few other issues. So in this bill, what we were trying to do is to help that organization to complete their rehab that they need to do for their facility, and then create this domestic violence shelter that is so needed for East African women. The document before you is one that came from Hennepin County Medical Center from a survey they did, and it describes the percentage of violence in Somali women and their families, and they assessed the prevalence and they talked about responses. And if you just look at these numbers, they're pretty astounding. And again, this is an unmet need. Although we have the ability for some of these women to go to various shelters, the cultural competence in those shelters is really lacking, and folks feel very isolated and often return to their abusers. And we're talking about people who, female women who were interviewed said that their female friends or relatives experienced physical abuse in 96% of their families. And female friends that were sexually abused was 98%. These are kind of astounding figures, and I hope it creates for us a sense of urgency in going ahead and dealing with this kind of funding. And the cultural needs are real specific. We had a good hearing on this, and I've talked with the chair of the committee, and I know right now that funding is not available in the House bill, but I'm hoping that with your thinking about this, Mr. Chairman and members, that we can go forward with what the Senate has decided to put some funding in. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I'd like to withdraw the amendment.
The A19 amendment has been withdrawn. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Fisher moves to amend Senate File 878, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A4.
The gentleman from Ramsey, Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak in favor of this amendment, which requests for a 2-year study on an issue that relates to our Asian Pacific Minnesota community. It's an issue that has been ignored by not only the mainstream community, but is also ignored by some people within the immigrant population itself. There's a problem that we're dealing with. It has to deal with gender-based violence. And it presents itself very differently in this community, and our mainstream media also does not always recognize it. Where I've become familiar with it is we've had an instance in my community where there was a domestic violence within an Asian household, and initially it involved in a situation where somebody was killed in the process, and the mainstream media ended up reporting this as a dispute over a cable bill. Shows there's a large disconnect occurring here. We need to figure out how we can better deal with this. And so what this bill would do is a variety of different things. First of all, it would provide for a multidisciplinary advisory group coming together to do a study. And the study would take a look at how Asian and Pacific Islander women are experiencing physical or sexual violence. And right now it's happening at a rate of twice the national average. Second, it takes a look at what's happening with Asian Pacific women and children, how the different forms take a look. And the reason we mention different forms of it is there are different things happening, whether it's domestic violence, sexual violence, there's trafficking, there's international abusive marriages occurring where people are going overseas, marrying people who are underage, bringing them back as their second, third, or fourth wives. And there's also instances of forced marriages that are occurring within these communities. These are some of the things that the study would get at. The other part that complicates it is that there's also an underlying process within the culture that when women are running into problems, that they are afraid to come forward, because if they come forward, they are isolated from their community and rejected by their respective family clans. And sometimes within this community, when that occurs, it causes a very extreme hardship, is because in some of these cultures, it is believed and strongly felt that when a woman dies, it is up to her husband's family to present her and take care of her for burial. But in instances of domestic violence, this does not occur, and as a result, there have been instances where after the woman has died and the family has rejected her, the husband's family has rejected her, the body has gone unattended and not cared for many months until somebody else steps forward to conduct a proper burial. These are some of the things that are happening in this community. So as a result, as a state government, we cannot allow this issue to continue on. It is important that we stand up and ask for support for our Asian Pacific Minnesotans, for their victims and their communities, and ask for this report to shed light on it so that we can address it. This is something that is supported by the mayors of Brooklyn Park, the Hennepin County Attorney, the city of Maplewood, which has the 5th largest Hmong population, the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, and the St. Paul Foundation. It's important that we do this because we need to be able to break the cycle of abuse that is happening. Many of the people are fearing retaliation and other pressures that are out there. At this point in time, I will withdraw it. I do know that the Senate has language that they have approved on it. This bill is the exact language of the Senate, and I would encourage Representative Cornish to accept the Senate language as it comes across. Thank you.
The A4 amendment has been withdrawn. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Ward moves to amend Senate File Number 878, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A20.
The lady from Washington, Representative Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I invite you to think back a few years. For some of us, it's quite a few years. And ask what story you would tell about something you did as a teenager that was really stupid. You know, kids do stupid things, right? Unfortunately, sometimes those stupid things have long-lasting consequences and lead kids into this track to prison unless we do something about it. And we have the opportunity to do that. First, I want to point out that on our desks today were a couple of papers from some law enforcement agencies talking about early childhood education as an intervention. And while I totally support that, it's too late for a lot of kids. We need to really work with our young people at all ages. So I have an amendment to support the youth intervention programs. I want to tell you a story about a 14-year-old boy. He says, when I began the youth intervention program with Boulder Options, I was failing in school, stealing phones, charged with third-degree burglary, stealing large quantities of food from the store, and for these reasons I was expelled from my school. And I realized that I needed to straighten up and fly right through the intervention program that was offered. It really helped me channel my energy in a positive way. The goal setting of these activities really helped me because I was surrounded by more positive influences. Another reason why I started to do well was my mentor. He was always a positive role model for me and encouraged me to do better, and he never saw me as a bad person. Now I'm succeeding in school. I'm in accelerated classes and have over a 3.0 GPA, and I'm not getting into trouble anymore. Instead of being known as a thief and a failing student, I'm known as a polite young gentleman that is an excellent student. I'm very thankful for YIP and getting to be part of Boulder Options program. Youth intervention programs work. Young people involved in youth intervention funded programs do better in school, improve life skills, and develop pro-social attitudes. And 9 out of 10 youth report successes such as they have not had police bring them home since they began the program. They did not receive a ticket, citation, or a new delinquency charge. It's effective. It saves money. The returns a benefit of $4.89 for every dollar of cost based on conservative assumptions about effects and valuations. Moreover, including a one-to-one match on community funding, youth intervention programs return $9.78 for every state tax dollar invested. I could go on and on with details. We hear in every committee about the return on investment. What we do know is that youth intervention programs spending an average of $2,000 per young person can save up to the equivalent would be $73,300 for a detention program, residential treatment. And then there are programs in between. But if we stop them at the beginning and do these intervention programs, we save lives. We save the futures of these young people. We do a lot of services for their families and help a lot of people. I would encourage you to vote yes. There are a couple of other people who would also like to speak, Mr. Speaker. There are a couple of other people who would like to speak to this.
Mr. Speaker,
Representative Thiessen.
I move we lift the call of the House.
Representative Thiessen moves to lift the call of the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails. We do have an amendment to the amendment at the desk. Unless, Representative Ward, if you'd like to, if there are other people that are supporters of this and you'd like to yield to them, we certainly can do that. But before we get to the amendment, we have to deal with the amendment to the amendment. All right, there is an amendment to the amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Dean R. moves to amend the Ward amendment to Senate File 878, second engrossment as amended, and the amendment to the amendment is coded RA 15-028.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Dean, to explain your amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. When I heard that there was a chance that this original amendment was not going to be accepted at $400,000, I made an attempt to have something included in our House bill that address youth intervention programs. And I reduced it from $400,000 to $50,000 a year, not because I thought it was the right thing to do, but I did it really out of desperation so that the House could pass a message on to the people of Minnesota that we do care about young people and we do want to see this happen. I do know that, Chair Cornish didn't have the most gracious target that he was given. He needed to make some tough choices. That was in the light of a $1.8 billion surplus that we had in the state of Minnesota. And we said that kids don't matter in the same way that other folks matter. And I think it's really important to think about these kids as an investment and not as an expense and not as spending. This is something that's going to have a long-term impact on the health of our state, the health of our economy, and the health of the people overall in Minnesota. So my understanding is even $50,000 isn't amenable at this point in time. So at this point, I'd like to withdraw my amendment.
Representative Dean withdraws the amendment coded RA 15-028. That leaves us on the Ward amendment before the body. Any further discussion on the Ward amendment? I should know where you're from, Representative Zerwas. The member from Sherburne, Representative Zerwas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I wanted to speak just briefly about youth intervention and the importance of youth intervention. What our justice system doesn't need is turning more young people into young criminals. And at any point and at any time, we can find a way to prioritize funding for youth intervention and juvenile detention diversion. That is a cost-effective, with proven return on investment approach to dealing with young offenders. I urge, as this bill moves through the process in conference committee, that we continue to work to find a way to fund these very valuable programs that have worked in every single county they've been implemented in as cost-saving measures. We can either give people healthy alternatives and help them turn their lives around, or we can turn them into criminals and pay to incarcerate them. At some point, we have to have a long view of this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Any further discussion to the Ward amendment? Representative Uglum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too rise to help youth intervention. Many of you know I was a chief author of House File 273. I won't belabor the point about youth intervention working. I'll give you a few figures. For every dollar that we put into youth intervention, we get $4.89 back, if you will, in terms of the return on investment. The youth intervention does work. If we send a child to a residential treatment home, it costs about $75,000, or a group home $56,000. So it's very expensive if these young kids get caught up in the wrong situation and we have to incarcerate them in these residential treatment centers and things like that. More importantly, not only do we feel that youth intervention works, but so does law enforcement. Minnesota Sheriff's Association, the Minnesota Chiefs Association, the county attorneys, the people that prosecute these youngsters, and also the Juvenile Officers Association, all have formally passed resolutions talking about the fact that youth intervention is a good return on investment. So as this moves through the process, and the Senate does have the $400,000, I believe, in their provisions, as this moves through the process, we hope, we pray that this money will be restored to youth intervention. One important thing to note, and I mentioned this in caucus too, is the youth intervention program lost a great deal of money from the feds. They lost $800,000 from federal grants this year. So to make them whole, we need this money, and we hope that during the conference committee that things will be restored. Thank you.
The member from St. Louis, Representative Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support the youth intervention programs too. I remember when corrections broke off from Health and Human Services. It used to be Health and Human Services and Corrections. And everything was included in the budget, and very little time was ever spent on corrections in those days. And this was in the 90s. And then corrections went with judiciary and public defenders and public safety. And in those years, YIPA, youth intervention programs, were always funded to match federal money. And then we came into the slump of the early 2000s and the 10 years of drought. But YIPA was still funded, and the House had a position for the program that served the kids across the state in the youth intervention programs, a prevention activity. And we always had a strong position. And I'll bet this will come back from conference committee, because I can't imagine it being erased from the Minnesota plan of corrections and prevention and attention to students and young people before they get into big trouble. I bet it will. But it really hurts to know that it's not in there now in the House position. Because for 30 years, at least 20, the House were the pushers of the funding. And people are relying on it. And students that are coming back from treatment, students that are coming back from corrections, and seeking help in the communities are looking for that help from the youth intervention programs. And without it, there's a hole. And they could slide. And we don't have money in here for more prison beds. And we don't want more prison beds or more secure juvenile treatment beds either. We want community action and activities, and that's what the youth intervention programs are. And we want a voice in the House for those programs.
The member from Washington, Representative Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Without this funding, students like Trenton won't have the support that they need. And even at $400,000 with the Senate's side, we're going to have a lot of students who are missing this support in the next 2 years. This is a statewide program, and students from all over the state, all over rural greater Minnesota, besides the metro area, benefit from these programs. It's with great respect that I want to honor Representative Cornish's budget. I realize that he had some tough decisions to make, and I trust that he's going to be able to bring back from conference committee the kind of support that we need for the youth intervention programs. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I withdraw the amendment.
Representative Ward withdraws the 820 amendment. There is another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Lesh moves to amend Senate File 878, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A6.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Lesh, to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment is, for lack of a better way to put it, safe harbor for adults. Those of you who were here in 2000 remember the landmark legislation that was worked on by many members of this chamber, ensuring that for the first time in Minnesota, youth who engage in prostitution would be viewed as victims and survivors, not as criminals. They would be treated with dignity and respect and directed to supportive services and shelter and housing that met their needs and recognized their right to make their own choices. So fundamentally, it did several things, including adding the definition of sexually exploited youth in Minnesota's child protection codes. It increased the penalties against commercial sex abusers or purchasers and directed the Commissioner of DPS to work with stakeholders to create a victim-centered statewide response for sexually exploited youth. And I'd like to share with you some facts about this condition of these women in our state, primarily women. 12 to 14 years old is the average age of girls prostituted or trafficked for sex and the age at which they are first victimized. 83% is the percentage of total sex traffic victims between 2008 and 2010 who are United States citizens. Over 50% domestic prostitution victims classified as runaway youth living on the street. 55% approximate number of street girls who became entangled in prostitution networks. 75% girls entangled in prostitution networks controlled by a sex trafficker or a pimp. Now, members, it was 1999 when Sweden first passed a law criminalizing the buying but not the selling of sex, and many outsiders at that time were dubious. It seemed a quirk of a weird thing that a nation like a Scandinavian country would do, something that we wouldn't do here. Yet since then, it has been incredibly successful. And let me be clear, it is not what other nations are doing. It is not the Netherlands, which in 2000 legalized prostitution. The conditions for women and girls in that country have deteriorated since that time. But in countries that have embraced the model that I just spoke about, including Sweden, Norway, Iceland, and now Canada, the condition for women and girls is getting better. Now, members, we did this landmark legislation for those who are trafficked in 2011. But I, as a prosecutor for the city, never got to see many of the victims of this crime because I prosecute adults in adult court. And the women that I see who are charged with prostitution or engaging in prostitution aren't at all that different from the younger girls, 16, 17, and as young as 14, that go through juvenile court. These are women who are victims, and I know for a fact as a prosecutor, from what I've seen, that we are not going to do our society harm if we ensure that we hold accountable the buyers and the traffickers and the pimps, but not these women. These are women who do not need to be in the criminal justice system. They need to be in treatment, and they need to be in supportive housing. So the reason I'm bringing this up now is you know that it is a radical departure from what we have looked at for the crime of prostitution in the state of Minnesota. I hope that we do consider this in future years, but I think I fully realize and expect that it's too big of a leap for people in this chamber to make now and today. So I hope members will consider this in future years so we can have conversations in committee. It is going to take many stakeholders to come together and see how we can improve the conditions for these young women in our state that aren't just the juvenile, but also women in their 20s and even older. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I would withdraw the amendment.
Representative Lesch withdraws the A6 amendment. There is another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Rosenthal moves to amend Senate File 878, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A26.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Rosenthal, to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, the 826 amendment funds the BCA's request for 13.5 FTEs in year 2017. All of these FTEs are agents. They are in digital forensics, financial crimes, and predatory crime units. They'll help in all of our communities throughout the state. There's no new there's no new personnel being added. These are filling vacancies that are currently vacant at the BCA. I want to thank Chair Cornish for running a very fair committee. I ask for a green vote and will stand for questions. Thank you.
The member from Blue Earth, Representative Cornish.
Mr. Speaker and members, I would suggest accepting this amendment. Some things do puzzle me a little bit or concern me to take it up in conference committee, because out of these, there's about 21 of these agents that aren't sworn officers, and the rest of them are. So I'd kind of like to find out which ones are sworn and which ones are carrying on dual duties of the lab and outside crimes and things like that. But I'll accept the amendment and advise a yes vote.
Any further discussion? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of adoption of the 826 Rosenthal amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Norton moves to amend Senate File 878, the second engrossment as amended as follows, and the amendment is coded A14.
The member from Olmsted, Representative Norton, to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this will look familiar to many of you. This amendment is the contents somewhat changed of the Lifesaver bill that went through 4 of your committees, and my constituent came up for every single one of those and was very excited, as was I, to see both bipartisan and unanimous support in all 4 of the committees that it went through. I'd heard from some people that there was concern that I was directing my services or this grant, which will go to police departments, to a particular service industry, and I want to be very clear that that isn't the case, that it is a voluntary program that will allow law enforcement agencies to select whatever vendor they want and provide a service to vulnerable children and adults, persons with Alzheimer's and autism, and other disabilities that would make them wander off and be difficult to find. This is a cost-saving measure. Those types of searches cost thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps some have even been $100,000 on those searches. If persons have this bracelet or ankle bracelet on, it makes them recoverable quickly, safely, and get them back home with their families who are missing them. So I have lowered the cost on this to $50,000 in each year, and I have found a funding source that I don't know much about, Representative Cornish, but I understand that it's an acceptable funding source that will not affect your budget. So I'm very hopeful that you'll accept this amendment, and I have the support of the body.
Discussion to the Norton amendment. The member from Blue Earth, Representative Cornish.
Mr. Speaker and members, I wish and advise to accept this with the same concerns. It comes from MinCor, which is a business that the prisons operate, and they've expressed some concern about all these amendments either coming from or could be coming from MinCor, but I would like to accept it, take it into conference, and look at it and see what we can do.
Any further discussion on the Norton amendment? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of adoption of the Norton A14 amendment signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Lesh moves to amend Senate File 878, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A15-0629.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Lesh, to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Article 2, Section 4 of this bill has been amendment to now apply the 4% interest rate to prejudgment interest. This basically will apply only to consumers. If you are a business, you will get the rate which everyone else enjoyed up until this time. But if you're a regular consumer dealing with a insurance company or the like, you end up getting far less money back from the situation. Those with contract rates, businesses with insurance disputes, will be entitled to substantially higher interest rates. So we have some amendments to the interest rate provision that point out the blatant power grab of the insurance industry in this bill and how unfair this change is to average Minnesotans. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I believe we have secondary amendments.
There is an amendment to the amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the first amendment.
Pinto moves to amend the Lesh amendment to Senate File 878, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment to the amendment is coded A15-0632.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Pinto, to introduce your amendment to the Lesh amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, as Representative Lesh described, the bill has a pretty significant change to the interest rate that is given to a prevailing party. So I just want to make sure we're very clear on this. The situation that's being described here is a situation where a party has won a lawsuit, and there's been a judgment that has been entered, but there's some sort of dispute afterwards that's going on. The question is, what should be the interest rate that should apply to that money that is owed from the party that failed to prevail to the prevailing party? The statute currently describes an interest rate of 10%, as Representative Lesch described. The bill sets up a differential, so a quite a bit lower rate that applies only to consumers. The bill, you may notice on page 21, carves out judgments of insureds, such as businesses against insurance companies. That rate stays high, but for consumers, the rate ends up being quite a bit lower. So the amendment before you simply provides that the interest rate which should apply for the prevailing party should be the interest rate that the prevailing party had to pay to a creditor. So, for example, somebody wins a judgment on a medical claim, but they have to have the money available to them in the meantime, so they have to get a loan. So the interest rate that applies for that loan is the interest rate that would then be owed by the party that lost to the party that prevailed. That seems eminently fair, and we certainly hope that you will give it a green vote, give this amendment a green vote. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I do ask for a roll call on this.
A roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Discussion on the Pinto amendment. The member from Sherburne, Representative Zerwas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. This amendment goes towards the changes in prejudgment interest that's included in Chair Cornish's bill. The important thing, members, is to give a little bit of history or perspective on this issue, and there's going to be several amendments on the Lesch Bridge Amendment, so I'll cover this up front. What ends up happening here with this change is years ago there was a change to move post pre and post judgment interest to 10%. The next year, members, the very next year, the state said, oh, hey, wait a minute, 10%, that's way out of line with what it used to be, and it's way out of line with what other states are doing, and that's too expensive. We should exempt us from that high interest rate. And guess what? You did. You did exempt the state from that 10% rate. You dropped it to 4%. And then cities and counties and school districts came in and said, oh, hey, wait, 10% is too high, it's onerous, and it's burdensome. Local governments can't pay that 10% rate. It's way out of step. And so you here in this body voted to change it for local governments, for your cities, for your townships, for your school districts, not at 10%, but down to 4%, because we decided 10% wasn't fair. But then you took every other business in the state and you stuck them with that 10% and said, no, you keep paying that high interest rate. It's okay for us. It's okay for government to pay that low rate. But private business, buckle up, because you're going for the full 10%. So we brought this through the committee process, and there was what I thought could be viewed as a compelling argument that said, hey, if we lower both pre-judgment and post-judgment interest rates, there could be a perceived benefit to delaying payment because of that low interest rate on an adjudicated case. It might be an incentive to stretch out if you have to pay for a claim. So I said, well, simple fix. We will only address the pre-judgment issue. And so all pre-judgment interest we would set at 4% or the T-bill, whichever is higher. But the minute that judgment comes down, and if you're found liable and you have to pay, it goes right up to 10% from that point forward. So there's no benefit to not pay a judgment in a timely manner. Members, these next amendments are going to muck it all up. Vote red on all of them. If you, I passed out a handout for prejudgment interest rates state by state. Members, 34 states are below 10%. Only 11 states are at 10% or above. And if you've seen the trend, they're all going down. That's been the history over the last few years. Members, we have a good bill. Chair Cornish has a good bill. Vote red on the amendment.
Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members, I was not here when in past sessions there may have been votes exempting the state or subdivision. I don't know anything about that. I don't see any language here that appears to be addressing that in any way. All I know is that there's a period of time after a verdict and before a judgment where the consumer is at that point getting a very low rate of interest. Mr. Chair, will Representative Zerwas yield?
He will yield. Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Zerwas, so if all that is the case, then why is it that when there's a dispute with an insurance company, when a company has that dispute, that the rate stays at that 10% level under the bill?
Representative Zerwas.
Mr. Speaker and members, that provision in the bill goes back to an agreement that was made when the original change was made several years back for local governments. That's an area that stakeholders have come to an agreement on, and we didn't want to disturb that previous agreement.
Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm pleased to hear that insurance companies and the companies that are their insureds have reached an agreement, but the fact is our job is to protect the people in Minnesota. And I guess let's frame this up for all of us members. We're talking about a verdict has been reached in court, and now one party has another party's money. The question is, what interest rate applies when the one party has the other party's money? Is it a significantly lower rate than would apply with this insurance company situation that's carved out in Section F? Or is it in fact the rate that the person whose money they don't have, they had to borrow money to replace it, is it that interest rate which would apply? That's the real question, members, and this comes down, to my mind, to just basic fairness. A verdict has been reached, a determination by a court. Now, if you don't believe in the verdicts that courts reach, I guess that's one thing. But if at this point we say a court has reached a verdict, a party has achieved that verdict, and at this point their money is now being held by somebody else. And to my mind, it's only fair that there should be an interest rate which reflects that fact and gets that dealt with. Vote green on the amendment.
Any further discussion on the Pinto amendment? Seeing no further discussion, and just as a reminder, members, we're on the A15-0632 Pinto amendment to the underlying Lesh amendment. The clerk will take the roll on the amendment. The clerk will close the roll. There being 60 ayes and 72 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There is another amendment to the amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Lesh moves to amend his amendment to Senate File 878, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment to the amendment is coded A15-0633.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Lesh, to introduce your amendment to your underlying amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. This amendment is pretty simple. It says, and I'll just read it straight up, if the judgment is obtained by active duty or honorably discharged military veteran, the interest rate shall be 10% per year until paid. So if you're in opinion, an active duty military or honorably discharged military veteran is as worthy of that interest as an insurance company, then you should vote green on this.
Discussion to the amendment. The member from Sherburne, Representative Zerwas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Thank you, Representative Lesh, for bringing this forward. I'm going to encourage all members to vote red on this. We will be treating all Minnesotans exactly as we treat our local governments, that we thought that a 10% interest rate was too high, too cumbersome, and too punitive. So we're going to go with the lower rate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, members.
Representative Lesh.
Thank you. Well, members, this is awkward, but it's right there in black and white. And I realize it's difficult, but there's no question. For those of you that like to vote for veterans and you vote against them when they're in a situation for an interest on judgment like this, it's going to be a difficult conversation that you think an insurance company is worth more than they are. So I'd ask that you vote green on this, and Mr. Speaker, I ask for a roll call.
Roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Further discussion on the Lesh amendment coded A15-0633. Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the amendment. The clerk will close the roll. There being 60 ayes and 72 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment to the amendment is not adopted. There is another amendment to the amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Hillstrom moves to amend the Lesh Amendment to Senate File 878, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment to the amendment is coded A15-0634.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom, to introduce your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Members, I've been speaking out against the provision that's in Representative Cornish's bill from the beginning. This change really is not fair to our residents. It now treats businesses in Minnesota better than it treats our citizens. So my amendment just really carves out and makes seniors, citizens who are eligible for Social Security, to get the same benefit as business gets. So members, if you want your seniors who have been wronged to be entitled to the same interest rate as businesses are entitled to, you should vote for my amendment. And I would ask for a roll call, Mr. Speaker.
Roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would encourage a green vote.
Discussion to the amendment. The member from Sherburne, Representative Zerwas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Again, I would urge members to vote no on this. We're going to treat senior citizens like we treat our schools, like we treat our townships, like we treat our cities. With that, vote no. Thank you, members.
Further discussion on the amendment. The member from Ramsey, Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And members, let's just make sure we're very clear on this. However everybody else is being treated, there are these businesses that are getting 10%. So the question here now is if you vote red on this, you're saying that seniors should get a significantly lower interest rate than those businesses that are carved out under the bill. Let's make sure we're very clear on what's going on. Thank you. And please vote green.
Any further discussion on the Hillstrom amendment? Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the amendment. The clerk will close the roll. There being 63 ayes and 68 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment to the amendment is not adopted. There is another amendment to the amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Atkins moves to amend the Lesh Amendment to Senate File 878, the second engrossment as amended. The amendment to the amendment is coded A15-0635.
The member from Dakota, Representative Atkins, to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Zerwas, I think that this one might just be a clarification. I'm not going to ask for a roll call unless you give that speech against it. But what this amendment does, since 1973 or 74, we've had the No-Fault Act here in Minnesota. It's for car accident cases. It's where people, occasionally folks that have suffered a car accident, they get sent by their insurance company and get cut off from having their medical bills paid. They can then go to an arbitration. An arbitrator makes a decision on whether those bills ought to be paid or not. And depending on the outcome of that, the bill either gets paid or it doesn't. Those bills that are in question sometimes will go for months without being paid. The hospital or the doctor will assess an interest rate, 1% or 1.5%. So under Minnesota law for in the neighborhood of 40+ years, we've had a 15% interest rate, so that if the arbitrator awards the bills, then the bills get paid in full. If the arbitrator, I'm going to say it once more because you're having folks talking to you, but if the arbitrator actually awards the bill, say you've got $2,000 in outstanding bills, the arbitrator can award that interest as well so that the bill gets paid in full. It's been that way for 4+ decades. That's what this amendment does, is it just carves out that exception to allow for that interest rate to continue to be in place. I don't think that your language in the bill and Representative Cornish's bill, Representative Zerwas, I don't think this was a target for that. But I'll let you speak to it, and then we'll decide whether or not to call for a roll call. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Zerwas.
Mr. Speaker and members, I'm going to urge members to vote red on this and not to adopt the Atkins amendment.
The member from Dakota, Representative Atkins.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A roll call, please.
Roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Representative Atkins.
Then I'm going to be a little bit more vociferous in my argument for it. I don't know if y'all were paying attention, but here's what this does. If Representative McNamara got hurt in a car accident, he went to an insurance company, his own insurance company to whom he had paid thousands of dollars in premiums, and they decided not to pay his bills, which they have every right to do. They then go outstanding for a few months, all right, or maybe a year. He goes to the arbitrator says, yes, in fact, Representative McNamara, those bills should have been paid. $2,000 in bills, there's an automatic 15% because sometimes the provider, the doctor or whomever just added another $200 or $300 in bills or in interest on top of those bills. So you get your $2,000 plus you get 15%. It's been that way, folks, for 40 years. You get that so that you can then pay the bill in full. So that Representative McNamara, when he goes and pays Regina Hospital down there in Hastings, he pays the total amount of the bill. That's what this is doing. Representative Zerwas, I'm baffled that you wouldn't want to have that. It's been this way for 4 decades, folks. And why you want to change that, I'm just befuddled, Representative Zerwas. I know that this is an ALEC bill. I know it's important to the insurance companies. I know it's number 4 in the tort reform playbook. This is not their target. It's been this way for 40 years. We want those bills, we want those providers, those hospitals, those doctors to end up getting paid in full. So please vote green for this amendment. You've just taken crappy votes against veterans. You've taken a crappy vote not to reimburse seniors. For heaven's sakes, this is a bill that we want to make sure our hospitals and our doctors get paid in full. Otherwise, it's Representative McNamara and the other 180,000 Minnesotans who end up in a car accident who end up having to pay that interest out of their own pocket. Folks, please vote green.
The member from Scott, Representative Lunan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Atkins, the insurance settlements or the interest on judgments should have a relationship to what the actual loss was. Insurance is designed to indemnify, and that interest settlement shouldn't be at a punitive level of 15%. We actually have several bills in the body right now trying to deal with the important problem of insurance fraud, and I see putting an interest level of 15% in there only challenging the insurance carriers when they take the time it takes to find out if the medical bills are valid or not pertaining to the auto accident. So I vote everyone to vote red.
Representative Atkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Lunan, will you yield for a question?
He will yield, Representative Atkins.
Representative Lunan, what do you think of the 10% then that businesses get? Is that punitive?
The member from Scott, Representative Lunan.
The basis that the 10% that the business gets, it should all be predicated upon what the current interest rate is. I just happen to be very versed in the insurance aspects of it, and I rise to that, and I'll speak to it again, that vilifying an insurance company for taking the time to do due diligence on researching a bill just isn't appropriate. And again, we have bills in the body here pertaining to the growing problem, the escalating problem of insurance fraud, and that this goes in a bad direction. Again, I urge everyone to vote red.
Representative Atkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative Lunan. So what you're saying is 10% is okay for business, but just 4% for individuals and for seniors and for veterans. Is that right? Would you yield to that question?
He will yield. Representative Lunan.
I'm rising to the 15% imposed on insurance companies. That's what I have a problem with.
Representative Atkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will Representative Lunan yield?
He will yield. Representative Atkins.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Lunan, will you answer the question, please? Do you support the 10% interest for businesses, but only 4% for veterans, for seniors, and for consumers who've incurred medical bills in a car accident?
Representative Lunan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Representative Atkins. I believe that the interest settlement shouldn't be predicated upon who you are. Just like in a car accident, who you are shouldn't determine what the interest rate is. It's what your actual loss sustained is. That's what it should be based on.
Representative Atkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative Lunan. So I assume then you voted for Representative Pinto's amendment. Will you yield?
He will yield. Representative Atkins.
For Representative Pinto's amendment?
Representative Lunan.
Thank you. And Representative Atkins, my premise on this is that the interest rate awarded should not be of a punitive nature. What it does is it causes an artificial pressure in a legal situation that is not advantageous to the victim necessarily. And so, again, I rise to the 15% settlement. I am dramatically opposed to that, and I urge all members to vote red on this amendment.
Representative Atkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Lunan, I'll leave you alone now. But you'll recall what you just said was that it ought to be what folks have to pay. Whatever, that's the amount that should guide it. Representative Pinto had an amendment earlier that said whatever it is that the consumer has to pay, because I can't go out as a consumer and get a 4% interest rate. Here I am, I've incurred all of these losses. They go on for months and months, sometimes years. Maybe you can, Representative Lunan, you can go get a 4% interest at your local bank. What Representative Pino suggested is that if you go out and you got to, let's say you get 10 or 11 or 12 or 15%, or even 7%, that's the amount that I can get. That's what you just said you'd support, and now you're undoing that. And I get that folks, I know that the ALEC folks and the insurance companies are really strong on this, and you want to be strong with them. But what you've got here on this particular amendment, as well as the Veterans Amendment, the Seniors Amendment, folks, they're going out into the market. They borrow the money at much higher rates than 4%. They win. They've actually been, Mr. Speaker, they've been found to have won. They prevailed. They won. They are owed the money. They had to go out and borrow that money in the meantime at a much higher rate than 4%, but you only want to give them 4% interest because that apparently is good for insurance companies or good for ALEC. Well, give me a break, folks. You're talking about people who are out a lot more than that. You're talking about existing Minnesota law pays businesses 10%, but you want to reduce everybody else, veterans, seniors, auto accident victims, everybody else will only get 4%, except for your business friends. I just don't get it. Members, please vote green on this amendment.
Any further discussion on the amendment? Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the amendment. The clerk will close the roll. There being 60 ayes and 72 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There is another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Atkins moves to amend the Lesh Amendment to Senate File 878, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment to the amendment is coded A15-0637.
The member from Dakota, Representative Atkins, to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I don't need to belabor this. I think we know the outcome, but I'll ask for a roll call.
Roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Representative Atkins.
This amendment makes it absolutely simple. Consumers versus businesses. This gives consumers exactly the same interest rate if they have to sue their insurance company and they win and they get their money. They get it with the same amount of interest that a business would. Minnesota business gets 10%. This would allow consumers to get the same thing. I passed these laws back in 2009 with bipartisan support and Governor Palente's signature. It treats consumers exactly like businesses. Vote no if you think businesses ought to be treated a whole lot better, 2.5 times better than consumers. Vote yes if you believe that consumers ought to be treated just as well as big businesses.
Discussion on the amendment. The member from Sherburne, Representative Zerwas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Again, I would urge a red vote on this. What we're asking for is we're asking for us to treat Minnesotans exactly as we're treating cities, counties, townships, hospital districts, any government unit members. And I know throughout the committee process, I think DFL member after DFL member told me about how this was in the ALEC playbook. Someone even brought a copy of the ALEC playbook to one of the committee hearings. I'll be honest, I'm a bad Republican. I'm not a member of ALEC. I don't have their secret playbook. And so that was the first time I saw it, although they wouldn't let me browse through it, so it was just from a distance. Members, let's be clear. I passed out a form, an item that talks about who really is in support of lawsuit reform. And is it the shadowy overlords? No, members. It's the Burnsville Area Chamber of Commerce. It's the Dakota Regional Chamber of Commerce. It's the Owatonna Area Chamber of Commerce. It's the Midwest Food Processors Association and 65,000 other employers in the state of Minnesota. That's what this bill is about. Vote red on the amendment. Thank you, members.
Any further discussion on the Atkins amendment? Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the amendment. The clerk will close the roll. There being 60 ayes and 72 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. Members, we're now back on the amendment, the Lesh amendment, coded A15-0629. Further discussion on that amendment. Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll ask for roll call.
Roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And members, well, those of you that voted no on this, you've made your position clear. You voted against veterans, you voted against seniors, you voted against consumers. And I remember, Representative Zerwas, in committee, it was the ALEC folks who were supporting this, and it was the lobbyist for the insurance companies, Bob Johnson, who was coming in and testifying this. And every time Bob Johnson testifies, I always ask him, if we're going to pass this bill that benefits the insurance companies, I got to know if this trickle-down theory you're proposing all the time really works. So are my insurance rates going to go down? And you know what he says every single time? He goes, well, I can't promise that your insurance rate would go down. And I thought, well, I thought giving money to rich people and corporations was somehow good for all of us because it would trickle down. I haven't seen my insurance rates go down anytime recently. In fact, for my properties, they're the only thing that's going up faster than my property taxes is my insurance rates every year. So members, even though you didn't vote to take care of veterans, take care of seniors, take care of consumers, and those other more prescriptive secondary amendments, you still have the opportunity to do the right thing here. I can only imagine the fundraising notices are going to go out this summer when you all vote for corporations on this and insurance companies. But I can't imagine if when you're asked at the door by a person, hey, you know, why is it that the interest on my judgment isn't as good as the interest on for that of an insurance company? Well, I wonder if saying, well, we just want to make you the same as cities and counties and townships, I don't think that's going to wash. So at the end of the day, your conscience is going to have to be clear. Vote green on this. Mr. Speaker, I'll withdraw the amendment.
Representative Lesh withdraws the A15-0629 amendment. There is another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Lesh moves to amend Senate File 878, the second engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A18.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Lesh, to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment is a prison construction moratorium. Members, the Department of Corrections is going to come forward next year with a $100 million bonding referendum. $100 million to incarcerate more people. Now, Minnesota already incarcerates a lower percentage of its population than any other state in the union, save one. We do an outstanding job of not paying for prison bed space, but we have a much higher percentage of keeping folks on paper, keeping folks on probation, keeping folks on supervised release. It's a much less expensive way to deal with folks in the criminal justice system and a much more efficient way. I'll give you an example of one judge who explained that when someone is let out on supervised release and their supervised release officer states that they get caught possessing alcohol or being in a jurisdiction they're not supposed to, they get to send them back to prison. And the judge's hands are tied. So they're sending these people back to prison who shouldn't be in prison. And we're paying for bed space for people who shouldn't be there. But we have a system in place that is much more able to handle these offenders within the walls of a system that costs approaching, if not exceeding, $100 a day per inmate. Spending on corrections since 1988 has ballooned from $12 billion a year to $53 billion nationwide. It's an extraordinary percentage of our budget here in Minnesota. Members, I'm not going to ask for a roll call on this, but I sincerely hope you give it strong consideration.
The member from Blue Earth, Representative Cornish.
Mr. Speaker and members, I fail to see the wisdom in this amendment. We're faced with more prison beds coming up, and especially if we, instead of sending these people to civil commitment where we're having the problem, send them to prison instead. And why we would want to limit building or construction of new prisons when we don't know, what's going to happen in the future, and hemming us in. I don't see the wisdom in this, and I would encourage a no vote.
Any further discussion on the amendment? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of adoption of the Lesh Amendment A18 signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There is another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Atkins moved to amend Senate File 878, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A24.
The member from Dakota, Representative Atkins, to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since I offered this amendment a few nights ago, I've been contacted by a number of families, including the family of David Riggs. This is an amendment that gets at texting while people are driving. David Riggs was killed 18 months ago right outside his home in Oakdale when he was hit by a driver who stated he had only been texting for a couple of seconds. Well, in that couple of seconds, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says you can travel the length of a football field in a couple of seconds. And it's like traveling the length of a football field blindfolded. They also found that texting while driving is 6 times as likely to cause an accident now as drunk driving, and 23 times as dangerous as, or 23 times more likely to get you involved in a car accident. So what this amendment does, and it builds on what Representative Horenstein did, right now the penalty's $50. In the bill, there's a provision, or in the transportation bill, there's a provision to increase that. What this gets at in the public safety bill, and I'm hoping that Representative Cornish will think this is a good idea. I don't plan to roll call it, but and in fact, Mr. Speaker, I think you have an amendment to it as well. But it increases the penalties for those who commit the same offense again, almost immediately, within a year. It increases the fine to $350 on the second offense, and if you're one of those people that just can't help yourself, and you continue to do this, and you continue to endanger other people, and you continue to kill people like David Riggs, then the fine goes up to $500 on a third and subsequent offense. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to pause because I think you've got an amendment to the amendment which changes it slightly.
I have withdrawn that. Representative Atkins. Any further discussion on the Atkins amendment?
Mr. Speaker.
Representative Yarusso.
Point of parliamentary inquiry. We're having difficulty identifying which amendment this is. I don't believe the number on the display board is correct. I can't find that. Then it doesn't, it says HO 849, not 878 on the display board.
Representative Yarusso, are you saying you do not have an amendment at your desk that has that coding?
We haven't been able to find it, no. But I'm wondering if the number on the display board is correct.
The number on the board matches the amendment I have.
Okay.
The amendment should be coded H0849A24. Any further discussion on the Atkins amendment? Representative Cornish.
Well, Mr. Speaker and members, I would recommend a red vote on this. We have another bill traveling through with transportation. We've already increased the penalties. I mean, we could go forever and make it a felony and this and that, but I think the body in the past has had a hard time increasing penalties on driving, especially Representative Rupkavina. And I think we've done enough on this already. We have another bill traveling the same as this one. I would just recommend a red vote. Otherwise, right now, with the surcharge we got of $75 or $77 and all these fines, it's going to add up to get a little outlandish. And texting is a serious violation, but we've already taken care of it, I think. So I'd recommend a red vote.
Representative Lunan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks for bringing this amendment forward, Mr. Atkins. I support your amendment. The only thing that you can do while driving that's more dangerous than texting is sleeping itself. This is a real problem on the roadway and doesn't necessarily affect the frequency of accidents. It has a direct correlation to the severity of them. I also want to thank Representative Atkins for informing me that he was picking on me. I come from an all-Irish family, and I wasn't aware of that until you told me that's what you were trying to do. I recommend a green vote on this.
Representative Atkins.
And thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think this is a big enough deal that I'd request a roll call, please.
Roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call.
And Mr. Speaker, just one bit of clarification, and that is, Representative Cornish, you're exactly right. There is a bill that's moving through that increases the penalty generally. What this gets at are those people that do it with such frequency that they're doing it within a year. This is back to back to back. These are folks that are serial texters that can't put the damn thing down, and they're killing people on our roads. I can't begin to tell you, folks, if you haven't heard from folks or if you haven't surveyed your members or your constituents, I had a town meeting last week, Wednesday night. We talked about this. I had a half dozen people come up afterwards who had been either struck or they had family members who'd been struck by somebody who was texting while they were driving. And the severity of these crashes, if it doesn't kill people like it did Mr. Riggs, it's maiming and badly injuring others. So, Representative Lunan, thank you for your support. Members, I'd urge a green vote.
Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Atkins yield to a question?
He will yield. Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Atkins, a few years ago, my wife bought one of these little tom-toms that guides you and tells you where to go. Does that qualify as illegal under this current statute that you're enhancing penalties on?
Representative Atkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Lesh, I appreciate the question. I am not changing the underlying law one bit. My understanding of the law is that it does not impact. So, for example, if you're listening to directions on your phone, that's not texting or sending a text message or an email message or an electronic message, but rather just listening to directions if that's what you're referencing.
Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a city prosecutor, I've run into this a few times, and Representative Atkins' attorney knows a lot about the law as well, so I'm not necessarily challenging that. However, it has been suggested that is. So for a guy like me that instead of using a TomTom uses the GPS on my phone to get where I want to go, or using iTunes on my phone to play my music instead of the radio, the law, excuse me, the law specifically states an electronic message includes but is not limited to email, text, instant message, a command or request to access a worldwide web page, or other data that uses commonly recognized electronic communications protocol. So it does not include a phone call, but it would include if I wanted to listen to iTunes radio or if I wanted to use the GPS advice, at least under my understanding. So not so much to challenge Representative Atkins' change of penalties, because I think it is probably warranted for the situations he describes, but I think the underlying statute for which we are changing penalties is probably a little bit broader than we had originally intended, although rightfully intended at the time. So I think that warrants a look in future sessions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Any further discussion on the Atkins amendment? Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the amendment. Clerk will close the roll. There being 65 ayes and 69 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There is another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Lomer moves to amend Senate File 878, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A1.
The member from Washington, Representative Lomer, to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. So my amendment's goal is to protect children from the harmful effects of obscenity and pornography. Studies have shown that there is abnormal traumatic brain rewiring in the immature and developing child's brain when they are exposed to these harmful materials. It is also well known that sexual predators and abusers and those who groom young children into sex trafficking will often use pornography and obscenity to break down natural barriers to this type of behavior. And I was really struck earlier by Representative Lesch's talking about children as young as 12, 13, and 14, girls. Anyway, this amendment attempts to deal with this issue. However, after having some conversations with Representative Hillstrom, I realized that there is more work to be done to assure that the language in this issue is in the correct section and the statute to deal with the perpetrators, and is in the statute that will deal with the perpetrators and not unintentionally harming the children. So I'm really grateful to Representative Hillstrom and also to Representative Pinto, who have agreed to work with me moving forward to get a bill to protect our children. I know that this is something that this body would like to do in a bipartisan fashion. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like to withdraw the A1 amendment.
Representative Lomer withdraws the A1 amendment. There are no further amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, Senate File 878, as amended.
Third reading. To the bill as amended, the member from Hennepin, Representative Hertaus.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I would like to thank Representative Cornish, Chair Cornish, for his leadership in this committee. Members, this is one of those committees where we don't have to disagree a lot of times. Public safety is in the best interest of everybody. And one thing I would like to tell you about or draw your attention to is one provision of the bill is titled Colton's Law. And for those of you folks who are not members of the Public Safety Committee, I would like to tell you a little bit about this, and I would also like to thank my colleagues in the committee, Representative Winkler, Representative Hillstrom, Ward, Schoen, Considine, Rosenthal, Dean, Urusso. All of you helped craft a better bill. And when we brought it through committee, it was apparent that there were some problems with it. And I also want to thank the Department of Corrections and also the Association of Counties for this legislation. Members, what this bill is about, and is part of this omnibus bill, is a circumstance named after Colton Gleason, who was visiting his friends in St. Cloud and was a victim of a sucker punch that was going on a couple of years ago. And as a result of this sucker punch, became a casualty and died. And we've come a long way with trying to fix the problem. This is a situation that could have been avoided because people who are incarcerated in Minnesota, we have a policy after release of incarceration, if they're going on to supervised release or intensive supervised release, oftentimes because we use private contractors, and not in every circumstance do we use private contractors, but in this circumstance we did, and there were a few days of lapse in implementing that equipment in order to supervise an offender, and it was during this specific time when this individual had a vacation from his sentence and was unsupervised that he chose to go out and commit this act. Members, I would like to draw your attention to the front of the floor.
Mr. and Mrs. Gleason, John and Julie Gleason, are here today. This means so very much to them to have this bill included. Could you please stand up, John and Julie, please? Thank you. This bill means very much that they don't want any other family in Minnesota to have to incur such a loss. To lose a child under this circumstance simply is unacceptable. And what we've done with this bill is we've changed policy to statute. And so for this, I thank all of the members for your hard work on this. And this bill has passed unanimously off the Senate floor. And with the inclusion in our omnibus bill, it's one step further to becoming law. So for all of that, I thank you very much. And I urge a green vote on the omnibus bill.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I also wanted to call attention to a provision in the bill that I think is very important, even though there's a few others that I don't like. There is, on page 5, lines 5 through 20, is the provision related to terrorism and anti-terrorism. And this is something that, of course, is very timely because we had the arrests of the 6 Somali youth last week. But I think it's also very important that we approach this issue not only with a sense of urgency, which we're doing today, but to also understand strategies to prevent this from happening. And unfortunately, we had an editorial in the Star Tribune earlier this week from our former Senator Coleman, which I thought was troubling, and he called us out as legislators, but worse than that, I think he kind of raised the temperature with regard to how we approach the Somali community. He wrote, in particular, it's time for the governor and legislature to raise more concern about our potential status as the land of 10,000 terrorists. That kind of rhetoric is not helpful in this sensitive moment. And in fact, he may not have read this particular provision, and he may not have known that on a bipartisan basis in the Ways and Means Committee, and I want to thank all of the Ways and Means members in both parties, and thank Representative Khan because she increased the allocation for the strategies to address this issue of combating terrorism here in the state of Minnesota, or terrorist recruitment. And so we have acted. We've acted urgently and strategically with a sense of purpose. We don't, former Senator Coleman goes on to suggest that we appoint a task force and hold legislative hearings. Well, that's code for admiring the problem as far as I'm concerned. So we're not admiring the problem, and thank you, Representative Cornish. We're taking action. There's a report that's required by the time we reconvene next year. And we're also getting money out to local law enforcement so they can work with community groups and others. And just to show you the degree of seriousness with which people take these kinds of comments, such as the land of 10,000 terrorists, in today's paper there was a response from a Somali leader, a city council member, Abdi Warsame, I believe the first Somali elected official nationally. And so he writes, "Let me assure the Star Tribune readers that there are not 10,000 terrorists among us. More than 100,000 Somalis and East Africans call Minnesota home. Nearly all of these people are citizens of the United States. For more than 20 years, East Africans have found new homes in this great state. We've integrated, have contributed to the economy, have educated our children here, have tried to create a better future for our families and fellow Minnesotans and countrymen." So this is very important to underline, that we can't start to divide people and polarize on this issue. And so I'll conclude by talking about an organization that I think is an example of the kind of group we want to support in this effort. It was a group that's working with Somali youth. They actually came to the synagogue where my wife is a rabbi at, Temple Israel, last year and did a presentation. I was very impressed. So I wanted to share with you very quickly and briefly about this organization. It's called Kajog, which is a Somali term for stay away. In this context, it's meant to encourage Somali youth to stay away from drugs, violence, radicalization, and other negative activities. And they have a number of different strategies to do that, including focusing youth towards higher education, civic involvement, and volunteer commitment to the community. This is the kind of effort, and this is the kind of organization we ought to be supporting, rather than putting forward very polarizing and harmful rhetoric in the pages of our newspaper, our large newspaper, the Star Tribune. And so, members, while this provision is tremendous, and we did it on a bipartisan basis, and we acted urgently in a very, very positive and constructive manner, there are other provisions in this bill that will keep me from voting yes. Some of the gun provisions, some of the consumer provisions that Representative Atkins and Representative Pinto called attention to. But I do believe that this very, very important allocation to the Department of Public Safety is going to be very, very helpful and useful as we work together to bring communities together to address this problem of terrorist recruitment in the state of Minnesota. Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I, too, would like to just address one particular aspect of the bill that relates to sex trafficking and promotion of prostitution. Representative Lesch and Representative Lomer both talked about that. There are aspects of the bill that concern me relating to firearms, and we've talked about the consumer interest rate provisions, but I'm really pleased about the progress that our state has made as reflected in the bill put together by Chair Cornish and his committee relating to sex trafficking. There are very important policy changes in here, moving our state along and recognizing victims of trafficking as the victims that they are, rather than the criminals that they in the past have been viewed as being. And there is some particular funding to investigate sex trafficking, which I think is extremely important. And I have to say I was pleased both to see original funding for a number of agents at the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension who will work on sex trafficking, among other areas. And with Representative Rosenthal's amendment that the chair accepted, there's going to be more of that as well. Having said that, the bill doesn't go far enough in a number of areas in my view, but of course that's simply the result of the tax bill. We've kind of seen this in a variety of budget bills that have been passing through. And when you have $2 billion in tax giveaways to corporate special interests, that leaves a lot less room. So I wish that there were more funding for victim services, for sexual violence prevention, but I'm very pleased with, given the target that Chair Cornish and his committee had with where they've allocated these funds. And I'm grateful to him and to them for their work and for the bill they put together. Thank you.
The member from Blue Earth, Representative Considine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to rise and support the bill. I usually don't take a lot of time when I stand up and talk, but I am going to take a little time today. A week ago yesterday, I was in Aiken to give a victim impact study on the death of my brother, who was killed October 2nd. I'd like to just take a few minutes to tell you about Tom. He was my younger brother. I was the best man at his wedding. For years, there was a little Vietnamese man that would run up to me that was a friend of the family, but the first question out of his mouth always was, "How Tom? How Tom family?" And I really didn't understand this obsession he had with my brother until at the funeral, my younger brother told me what it was about. Shortly after the fall of Saigon, Mr. Ho and his family moved down to one end of the block. At the other end of the block was the church that was sponsoring him. Every day, every couple of days, Mr. Ho would walk down. Nobody paid any attention to him. He didn't really speak English. My brother was 16 at the time and was taking apart a Volkswagen. And he noticed Mr. Ho and started talking to him and pointing out what he was doing and just engaged him. And pretty soon the family noticed that Mr. Ho timed his walks so that he could see Tom. And every day, Tom would stop what he was doing, engage this older man who nobody else was paying attention to, and tell him what he was doing. And it was the only person that was doing this for him. And so for 20 years afterwards, 30 years afterwards, this man remembered Tom and how kind he was to him, and Tom was 16 at the time. The other thing I would like to point out is that my brother spent his entire adult life serving his country and protecting this country. He retired as a major in the Air Force. He was 55 when the gentleman blew through a stop sign, T-boned him, and killed him. When I was in Aiken a week, 8 days ago, the judge did depart upward. They charged him with one misdemeanor. He got 30 days of house arrest with a ankle bracelet. That was insufficient. My brother deserved better than that. And I want to thank Representative Garofalo for adding this provision, and I will be voting yes on the bill. Thank you.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom.
Mr. Speaker, if there's others, I would like to speak last as the lead.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Kahn.
Mr. Speaker and members, I would like to follow up on the excellent speech that Representative Hornstein made, pointing out on the outrageous column that former Senator Coleman had written, essentially targeting Somalis as terrorists, and then giving the excellent, also quoting the excellent response from one of my council members and good friends, Abdi Warsame, to do it. Well, what was so offensive about Senator Coleman's speech was that he grew up as I did, as a Jew in Brooklyn, New York, in practically adjacent neighborhoods. Had he only looked at the Torah or the scripture portion for this last week, he would have found the proper advice in Leviticus 19:33 to 34, which says, and I know many people may know this, when a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And I hope that former Senator Coleman will look at that and take those words to heart the next time he's about to speak. Thank you.
The member from Stearns, Representative O'Driscoll.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising today to say that I'm also supporting the public safety bill. There's a provision in here that I've worked for 3 years to try to get included in the public safety bill, and that's the de-escalation training for our public safety officers and officials, police, fire, EMS. De-escalation training and the funding that's in here is going to be targeted to training Minnesota's law enforcement, ambulance, and other public response personnel to learn how to deal with veterans who are having difficulty, who may be ready to harm themselves or others. We do not have an epidemic in this state of veterans doing things that they shouldn't be doing. But one thing I know as a son of a law enforcement officer is I was real happy that my dad came home every night. And if I can equip other law enforcement officials with the skills, the talents, the resources to be able to go in and de-escalate a situation, to protect the veteran, their family, law enforcement, other public safety officials, I'm voting yes on that provision today. Interestingly enough, my dad was also on the other side, a veteran. So I come at this from two different angles. I want to thank, at that time, Chair Mary Murphy of the State Government Finance Committee when I brought this provision forward. We worked on it, and Representative Murphy said, we'll continue to work on it. This is worthy. Then, who's no longer with us now, retired Representative and Chair Paymar said, people seem to like this, O'Driscoll, let's make it happen. Well, we weren't able to make it happen the last 2 years. This year when I introduced that bill, the first person next to me said, how are we going to get this done, Representative O'Driscoll? And that was Representative Purcell's. He and I served together on the Veterans Committee. And Chair Cornish, I want to thank you and your committee for including this to take care of our law enforcement, public safety folks, and our veterans so that all things end happily ever after for everyone. I leave you members with this thought. How do we know if this works? Because we don't see things in the newspaper or leading the evening news that we had problems. Members, I encourage each and every one of you to vote yes today. Thank you.
The member from Lyon, Representative Swedzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I also want to just rise in support of this bill. House File 71, which is Drake's Law, is in Representative Cornish's Omnibus public safety bill. Drake Bigler was a young man, 5 months old, killed by a repeat drunk driver. And for those of you in the Public Safety Committee heard that bill, it increases the maximum potential penalty for repeat drunk drivers in the case of vehicular homicide. You know, it's a small bill that will hopefully keep repeat drunk drivers off the road. Brad and Heather Bigler, the parents of Drake, they came before committees to testify this year and came and did press conferences last year. Brad has reached out to a lot of our communities throughout southwest Minnesota, across our state, for the lessons that they've learned as a family in dealing with tragedy. He's the coach of Southwest State Ben's basketball team in Marshall, and they've taken a leadership position and really worked at trying to get young kids off the road. They just came to Marshall and to Minneota to show off actually the vehicle that they were in as a family when they lost members of their family to that horrific crash. And you know, I'd appreciate your consideration on this bill. I know that there's a lot of different things in this bill. Some folks can support, some folks can't. But I just want to ask you all to keep the Bigler family in your thoughts and as you move forward. So thank you very much.
The member from Meeker, Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members, and I'd like to thank Representative Cornish for his work on this bill and for a provision included in it that Representative Pawlowski and I have worked on over the years. This provision provides potential disaster relief for up to 2.5 million Minnesotans who are served by rural electric co-ops. So this is a very important measure for rural Minnesota, and I urge support of Senate File 878.
The member from Washington, Representative Detmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and also Representative Cornish, thank you for including a bill that I've carried that we brought in last year at a constituent that was injured, permanently disabled, working at our correction institution. And also this year we will cover insurances for those that are injured, permanently disabled, working in our correction institutions, also mental hospitals. So that is a big, big step in the right direction for those that are working in those institutions. Thank you.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Isaacson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank on a bill from Representative Garofalo on the distracted driving. I too have a family in my district that was affected by John Larson was killed at a stop sign that another individual drove through, and I was actually hoping to go a little farther than we did this session because I think that we do need to take into consideration past behavior of drivers, and in a situation where someone has a history and a pattern of willfully disregarding stoplights, stop signs, or traffic violations is showing something a little bit more malevolent than just a random by accident situation of someone who was just reaching for a Cheeto or the radio knob. And so I hope that down the road we can take a further look at this, but I'm really pleased that we're going to have this go through. I think we need to take steps forward, especially for folks to heal in this process that justice is being served. Thank you.
The member from Washington, Representative Schoen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And
And first, I got to say, you know, this is one of those committees that both sides really do get a lot of attention on bills and issues. And Representative Cornish, I know that goes both ways. Even when Chair Paymar was the lead last year, everybody got a chance to do what they needed to do. And you certainly do not run that committee like a dictator, and I appreciate that. But one of the things that I want to talk about was ignition interlock. Representative Hertaus had a bill that came forward, but you know, unfortunately, previously when we talked about ignition interlock, which will save lives because that means somebody cannot drink and drive physically, but it got used in the campaign, and it got politicized. And that's a shame. And we have to, at some point, be able to sit here and not be so hungry for power to politicize all the things that come through here, because that is a good piece of policy to make sure that folks don't drive drunk. They physically can't. So there are so many other things that we do around here, but that is just one of them. And I know Representative Norton carried a piece of legislation related to ignition interlock. That is something that we should start talking about. And it's unfortunate that we can't in many circumstances. I wish we could just have this list of things that we agree to on the back wall of the retiring room. Don't worry, that won't be on campaign literature. This is a big deal to Minnesota. Maybe we can figure that out. Thank you, Representative Cornish. There's a lot of good things in here, some not so great, but that's the way it works every year.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. You know, I want to say that Public Safety Committee was a great committee this year. We worked bipartisanly, and there are a lot of great things in this bill that has been mentioned. Unfortunately, I'm going to encourage all of you to vote no. This bill continues to expand the number of guns and rifles and suppressors now, and all these things out into the state of Minnesota, and that includes out into my district as well. And when it comes to the issue of public safety, the proliferation of weapons in the state and the increase of them just allows more to come in to my neighborhood, where unfortunately not all great things are done with this. And I know that Chair Cornish and I disagree on this, and hopefully we can continue to work together on a lot of issues. But I just wanted to say that I believe there are a lot of great things in this bill, but unfortunately I'll be voting red. Thank you.
Any further discussion? The member from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to first thank Representative Cornish. Representative Cornish did run a very fair committee, and DFLers got bills heard and Republicans got bills heard in a very fair manner. Members, the only thing that's wrong with this bill at all is what's not in it, and that isn't Representative Cornish's fault. That's the target that he was given. Members, the judiciary is our third branch of government, and we have a responsibility to fund it. They asked for 5 and 5, and unfortunately, based on the money that Representative Cornish received, they are only receiving a 1.5% increase in the first year and 1.5% increase in the second. He did a lot with what he had. However, there are many, many things that unfortunately we were not able to do in the bill. So members, there's also a lot of really good policy that was added to the bill, and many of you have all spoken about each of those provisions. Members, one of the things that I want to make sure folks know is in the bill is Representative Hertaus' bill reducing to 0.16 double the legal limit on DWI. That is in the bill. Many people talk about that and care about that particular issue, and that really hasn't been talked about here much today. But I think members need to know that that in fact is in the bill. Representative Cornish, we don't always agree, but I think for the most part you have a very good bill here. And members, no matter what issue you're passionate about, I think you can find some good things in this bill, and I think you can find some things in the bill that you might not just quite be satisfied with. So I'll be voting yes today. Thank you, Representative Cornish, for running a great committee, and all the members for working bipartisanly. As you heard on the floor, each member said we worked together to improve the language. We believe that public safety is important to Minnesotans. It's a core function of government, and that is the way that we should be running all of the committees in the Minnesota House.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I'd like to start out by just thanking Chair Cornish and Vice Chair Johnson, both whom I might note are in law enforcement. You put a lot of time and effort into this, and you put forth a great bipartisan bill. I just want to talk a little bit about some of the provisions in it. And first of all, this bill, it does effectively do what is one of our core functions of government, and that is protecting people. Some of the key reasons I support this bill, and a few other members have talked about the first one, is that it directs the Department of Public Safety to collaborate with federal, state, and local officials to develop strategies for working effectively to combat the recruitment of Minnesota residents in terrorism groups such as ISIS. I think that's hugely important that we're taking a step to work on that. The bill also enhances the penalty for criminal vehicular homicide when a person has certain prior driving-related convictions, and enhances the penalty for reckless driving causing great bodily harm or death to another. In addition, it strengthens sex trafficking laws and funds strategic grants to law enforcement to combat sex trafficking. So not only will this legislation better protect Minnesotans, but it also supports those who put their lives on the line every day to keep safe. Members, I would urge a green vote.
The member from Blue Earth, Representative Cornish.
Mr. Speaker and members, I've always believed that after you talk about a bill for a couple hours and go over most of the aspects, that the author shouldn't stand up and rattle on for another hour, so I'm going to be very brief. I won't spend a lot of time justifying things in this bill because I think most of you folks already did. The bill passed the committee on a 15-2 vote, and we picked up, well, one of those no votes today already, so I think that it was as best we could do, and we did have a generous target. I thank the leadership for that, and then I forgot to thank my committee members and my vice chair, Representative Johnson, all my committee members on both sides for their cooperation. We did very well. So just a couple of points quick is I've already heard from a couple of the sheriffs that say they already have these working groups going with the at-risk communities, and so that $250,000 they said they could grants they could put to good use. They're already on the ground working on that. The other thing is the difficulties we had this year with the bill, you can imagine that anything we took this from, all of our priorities, from women's shelters to crime victim services, MinCorps, there wasn't many places to take the money. So anything you tried to balance to another would take away from some very important. And so that's how we tried to spread it around in the different places and be as fair as we could. So thank you all for your support, and I wish you would give me a green vote on the passage.
Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. The clerk will close the roll. There being 115 ayes and 19 nays, the bill is passed as amended and its title agreed to.